Have you ever wondered, if one day you were thrown back more than 3,000 years into the heart of a blazing ancient Egyptian battlefield, could you survive even a single day? Imagine, before you is the burning sun of the desert, the sand so hot it could scorch your feet. The air is thin, arid, and thick with billowing dust. And in the distance, thousands of warriors are advancing with a thunderous tread, their long spears held high, heavy wooden shields clashing against one another, the relentless beat of drums like the very heartbeat of an army. This is the world of ancient Egyptian warfare, a brutal arena where life and death are separated by a single breath. To the Egyptians, war was not merely a clash for territory or power. It was a symbol of eternal order against chaos, a philosophy encapsulated in two core concepts of Egyptian culture: Maat, order; justice, balance; and Isfet, chaos, destruction. Every campaign a pharaoh launched was not simply to expand lands, but was seen as a way to defend Maat from foreign forces who were considered the embodiment of Isfet. But for you, a modern person accustomed to sofas, air conditioning, and fast food, surviving in that storm of fire and blood would be nearly impossible. Even true Egyptian soldiers, trained from a young age, could hardly overcome all the challenges of the battlefield. The military world of ancient Egypt is recorded in many documents, from the reliefs carved on the walls of Karnak Temple to papyrus scrolls preserving military orders. These records show that this was no game for the weak. The army was tightly organized, and its weapons, though seemingly crude, were incredibly effective in the hands of seasoned warriors. Every step you took into that land could be your last. To picture it more clearly, imagine a day in the march of an Egyptian soldier. You must wake before dawn to prepare your weapons, a heavy shield weighing on your arm. You must march for dozens of kilometers under the 40-45 degrees Celsius, 104-113 degrees Fahrenheit desert sun, with only a little water stored in a leather pouch. You must eat simple dry rations, usually just hard bread, onions, and garlic, something you, accustomed to fast food, would find almost impossible to swallow. And when the war horns sound, you must charge forward, facing a rain of arrows, thundering chariots, and the cold tips of spears aimed to pierce your flesh. Even if you think, "I'll just stay in the back for safety," remember that the rear was no less dangerous. In ancient warfare, there was no concept of a safe zone. A stray arrow, a fall amidst the shoving ranks, or simply crippling thirst was enough to end a life. Furthermore, the ancient battlefield had no modern military medics, no painkillers, no field hospitals. Being wounded meant you could die from blood loss, from infection, or worse, be left in the desert for the vultures and jackals. This is the stark reality of ancient Egyptian warfare, a place where death is a constant companion. So, why would you almost certainly not survive? To answer that question, we need to delve deeper into the structure of the army, the weapons, and the tactics of ancient Egypt, everything that created a brutal war machine where an individual's survival was almost purely a matter of luck. If you think ancient Egyptian warfare was just about clobbering each other with clubs or crude bronze knives, you are gravely mistaken. In reality, the Egyptian army was one of the most professional and well-organized forces in the ancient world. It was not a disorganized mob, but a massive war machine, operated by discipline, strategy, and unshakable religious belief. Within that machine, your survival, as a modern person unaccustomed to hardship, would be virtually zero. Let's analyze the reasons one by one. 1. The military system. You weren't given a choice. You were forced. The early Egyptian army relied on conscripts, meaning farmers were mobilized when needed. But later, especially during the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BC, the army became professionalized. This meant, if you were a farmer, you could be called to serve at any time during the harvest season. If you were a prisoner of war, you could be turned into a mercenary or a slave soldier. And if you were an ordinary Egyptian, you could not evade service as the pharaoh's command was absolute. Therefore, you couldn't request an exemption. You would be thrown into the vortex of war with no other choice. 2. Training. Beyond the endurance of a modern person once in the army, you would undergo grueling training. Long march. Soldiers had to walk for dozens of kilometers under the desert sun, carrying their shields, spears, bows, arrows, and rations. Physical conditioning. They practiced spear throwing, archery, and hand-to-hand combat, all in harsh conditions without any cold spring water or air-conditioned breaks. A Spartan existence. The main diet of a soldier consisted of hard bread, onions, garlic, and weak beer, things that provided energy but were completely foreign to the modern palate. Just marching in 40-45 degrees Celsius heat would be enough to make most of us collapse from heat stroke. You could die from dehydration before even seeing a battle. 3. Weapons and equipment. The weak would surely die first. They may sound simple, but ancient Egyptian weapons were a nightmare to face. Composite bow, made of wood. Animal sinew and horn, this bow was many times more powerful than a simple bow. An arrow fired from it could pierce bronze or leather armor. Think you're safe from a distance? You're wrong. You could be struck down before even seeing the archer. Long spears and javelins, used for thrusting or throwing. In a dense formation, dozens of spears could be pointed at the enemy simultaneously. If you stumbled or fell, a wall of spear points would impale you. Battle axe and koppish. The koppish, a distinctive curved sword of Egypt, could be used for slashing as well as hooking an opponent's shield to pull them off balance. Facing it, you'd have little chance to defend yourself. Shield. While meant for defense, the wood and leather shields of Egyptian soldiers were also extremely heavy. If you were weaker, you wouldn't be able to hold it up for long, making you an easy target. 4. Chariots. The tanks of the ancient world. You would never survive an encounter with an Egyptian chariot, the pride of the Pharaoh's army. The chariot was light, extremely fast, usually pulled by 2 horses, and carried 2 men, a driver and an archer. From a distance, chariots charged like a storm, with the archer firing arrows continuously, leaving the enemy no time to react. If you were just an infantryman, or worse, a modern person thrown into the past, you would have no chance of escape. The speed and power of the chariot far surpassed your ability to run. 5. Disease and harsh conditions. The invisible enemy, even if you managed to dodge the spears and arrows, you would still face the most terrifying enemies: disease and the climate. Heat. The desert heat causes rapid dehydration. Food and water. Rations were scarce and water was easily contaminated. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and malaria could kill you faster than any weapon. Medical care. There were no antibiotics, no modern doctors. A small wound could easily become gangrenous. Historically, more soldiers died from disease than from combat. This means that even if you dodged every arrow, you could hardly escape your fate. 6. Morale and religion. You could not fit in. Egyptian warriors fought not just with muscle, but with religious conviction. They believed they were fighting for the pharaoh, the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth. To them, dying in battle was not necessarily a tragedy, but a glory. And you? A modern person who doesn't believe in Horus, with no blood ties to the land of the Nile. Would you dare to charge forward as they did? Or would you tremble and look for a place to hide? 7. No place for an outsider. Even if you survived a few days, you would soon be viewed with suspicion by your comrades. The Egyptian army operated as a collective. An outcast who couldn't keep up with the formation and couldn't understand commands in ancient Egyptian would quickly be left behind or Worse, eliminated. You would have no one to rely on. In war, mercy is a rare commodity. In conclusion, why you would certainly not survive. You could not withstand the climate and survival conditions. You lack the physical strength to march and carry heavy weapons. You are not accustomed to poor rations and lack of water. You have no combat skills to face bows, spears, and chariots. You lack the religious faith to march toward death. All these factors combine to give a clear answer. If thrown into ancient Egyptian warfare, you would not survive. But to truly feel the ferocity, let us step into one of the greatest battles in Egyptian history, a place where blood, sweat, and hot sand mingled, and the fate of tens of thousands was decided in just a few days. That is the Battle of Kadesh, the pinnacle of brutality. Have you ever seen epic movies where tens of thousands of soldiers clash in hand-to-hand combat? The beat of war drums is deafening. Chariots charge thunderously, and arrows blot out the sky? Now multiply that scene tenfold. That was the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC, one of the largest battles of the ancient world, where the Egyptian empire of Pharaoh Ramesses II confronted the mighty Hittite Empire. This was not just a battle, but a fateful showdown between two superpowers. And if you were thrown into the middle of that battlefield, your fate would almost certainly be sealed before sunset. Kadesh, a strategic city on the Orontes River in modern-day Syria, was the crown jewel of the Levant. Whoever controlled Kadesh would control all trade between Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and Egypt. The Egyptians wanted Kadesh to expand their influence northward. The Hittites, from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, wanted to hold it as a fortress against the Pharaohs' expansionism. Pharaoh Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, had only recently ascended the throne and was eager to assert his power. He decided to lead his grand army north, and Kadesh was the target. According to records, the Battle of Kadesh involved tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands of chariots, the ultimate weapon of that era. Egypt, approximately 20,000 soldiers, divided into 4 large divisions named after gods Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Hittites, approximately 40,000 soldiers with over 3,000 heavy chariots, superior in number. Just try to imagine. In the dusty desert, 60,000 people are shouting, the hooves of thousands of horses are thundering, and the ground is shaking as if from an earthquake. You, an unfortunate soul thrown into this, could you even breathe under this terrifying pressure? Ramesses II advanced but made a fatal mistake. He believed false intelligence spread by the Hittites. Hittite spies pretended to be defectors, reporting that the Hittite king was still far away. Ramesses believed them and pushed his army forward quickly, leaving the other divisions far behind. When Ramesses II's division, the Amun division, set up camp near Kadesh, they suddenly fell into a trap. The entire Hittite army was already lying in wait inside the city. Suddenly, from the gates of Kadesh, over 2,000 Hittite chariots stormed out like a tempest. The sound of hooves echoed, dust and sand filled the air, and arrows rained down. In a flash, the Egyptian formation was crushed. If you were there, you would witness only horrifying scenes. Egyptian soldiers being crushed under chariot wheels, screaming in despair. Spears piercing bodies and dragging them across the sand. Shields splintering, armor being torn apart, and blood dyeing the Orontes River red. Can you imagine surviving amidst that sea of panic? Just when defeat seemed certain, Ramesses II did something that made his name immortal. He personally led a counterattack. He mounted his chariot, composite bow in hand, firing arrows and shouting commands to rally the remaining troops. Legend says Ramesses II was like Montu, the god of war appearing in the desert, causing the Hittite forces to falter. But the truth was likely harsher. It was a stroke of luck. Egyptian reinforcements, the Niran division Canaanite allies, arrived just in time, saving the situation. Without them, Ramesses II would have hardly survived. For you, an ordinary person, you would certainly never have the chance to turn the tide like Ramesses. The Battle of Kadesh ended without a clear victor. Although Ramesses II escaped death, he failed to capture the city. The Hittites also failed to destroy the Egyptian army. The two sides were later forced to sign a peace treaty, considered the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world. But let's look behind the scenes. Thousands of soldiers lay dead, their bodies piled up. The Orontes River flowed red with blood, littered with broken shields. Survivors staggered in despair, many having lost arms or legs, or dying slowly from infected wounds. If you stood there, you would not see glory, but only hell on earth. You could not outrun chariots charging at 40 kilometers per hour. You could not hide from a dense rain of arrows. You could not remain calm while 20,000 people screamed in chaos. And even if you survived the first day, you could still die a slow death from thirst, hunger, disease, or being left behind. The Battle of Kadesh is the clearest proof. Ancient Egyptian warfare was no place for a fragile modern human. The aftermath. When survival is a prolonged sentence. If you think the survivors of Kadesh were the lucky ones, wait for what comes next. Because the truth is, even if you survived, your fate would be nothing more than a prolonged sentence. When the war drums fell silent, when the desert dust settled, what remained on the battlefield of Kadesh, and on any ancient Egyptian battlefield, was not splendor, but the ruins of humanity. If you imagine that upon returning, conscripted Egyptian soldiers would be welcomed as heroes and receive worthy rewards, you are mistaken. The reality was much harsher. Most of them never had the chance to return, and those who did carried scars that would never heal. The slow, agonizing death of the wounded. On the battlefield, many soldiers did not die instantly from a spear thrust or under a horse's hoof, but days or weeks later. Open wounds, without antibiotics, quickly became gangrenous. Arrowheads that couldn't be fully removed caused infections, high fevers, and a slow death. Many soldiers were left behind in the desert, becoming prey for vultures and wild animals. There are even documents suggesting that after Kadesh, many Egyptian soldiers were abandoned by their own comrades, who couldn't carry any more of the wounded during the retreat. Can you imagine that despair? A life of hardship for the lucky ones. Assuming you were lucky enough to return home, life would not be any easier. Conscripts were usually poor farmers. After the war, they returned to their fields, but many had lost an arm or a leg, rendering them unable to work. Many suffered from chronic illnesses due to old wounds, leading to a life of disability. There was no veterans' pension system like in modern times. You could only rely on your family, who were also poor. Surviving, only to drag a broken body through life, that was the fate of most Egyptian conscripts. The invisible wounds, PTSD in the ancient world. War leaves not only physical scars but also deep psychological ones. Imagine having just seen tens of thousands of your comrades die horribly, their screams haunting you night after night. Modern people call this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. For the Egyptian conscript, no one understood and no one treated it. They suffered in silence. Many went mad. Many lived the rest of their lives in fear, flinching at loud noises. So survival did not mean peace. For them, death on the battlefield was sometimes a kinder fate. The anonymous sacrifices. In temples and on stone stelae, we see carvings of heroic pharaohs and mighty generals. But how many mention the names of the nameless conscripts? They were the small cogs in the war machine, swept up in a vortex of power. In life, they were not honored. In death, they were not remembered. All of it was to build the legend of the Pharaoh. If you were one of them, you would soon realize your life was worthless to the empire. The ripple effect on society. The consequences of war were not just expanded territories or signed treaties. The greatest consequence was shattered lives. Thousands of families lost their breadwinners. Thousands of children were orphaned. Thousands of women lost their husbands, becoming widows in their youth. Meanwhile, the Pharaoh sat on his throne, receiving praise and building temples to commemorate his achievements. The conscripts, the ones who directly endured the fire and blood, would forever remain anonymous shadows. If you think all that remained was pain, that's not entirely true. Because from the ashes of war, valuable legacies and lessons still remain for modern humans to reflect upon. That will be the content of Part 5, Legacy and Lessons Learned. Part 5, Legacy and Lessons Learned. Ancient Egyptian warfare, especially battles like Kadesh, didn't just leave behind corpses in the desert or nameless graves. It also left lasting legacies, military, cultural, and spiritual, that still give us pause for thought today. Military innovations. The Egyptians continuously improved the art of war. The chariot became a symbol of royal power. It was the first tank in history, ushering in an era of battlefield mobility. The composite bow, a weapon adopted from the Hyksos, was improved and became a deadly tool, laying the foundation for later dynasties. Military organization. From a force of conscripted farmers, Egypt built a professional army, a legacy that many other ancient nations emulated. Today, when we look at modern military academies, we can still see faint echoes of these principles. Organization, training, and discipline. The dawn of diplomacy. After Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittites signed the world's oldest surviving peace treaty around 1259 BC. The text, in cuneiform and hieroglyphics, was carved on stone tablets, and several copies exist to this day. Notably, the treaty was not just a ceasefire but a commitment to long-term cooperation. The two sides agreed to not attack each other, support each other if invaded by a third party, repatriate prisoners and not harbor fugitives. This was one of the turning points in the history of human diplomacy. Today, a replica of this treaty is displayed at the United Nations headquarters as a symbol of the aspiration for peace, propaganda, and the forging of legends. The Egyptians didn't just fight battles. They recorded them, carved them on temple walls, and turned them into legends. At the temples of Abu Simbel and Karnak, we see reliefs depicting a heroic Rameses II on his chariot, bow in hand, single-handedly routing hundreds of Hittites. In the inscriptions, the pharaoh is glorified as the defender of Mat, cosmic order against chaos. Although the reality was somewhat different, Ramesses II was saved by reinforcements. These records show that war was not just about fire and blood, but also a tool for building myths and consolidating political power. Today, we still do the same thing. Just instead of carving stone, we record it in films, books, and on the internet. Lessons from ancient Egyptian warfare. There are at least 3 major lessons. 1. War is always paid for with human lives. Behind every pharaoh's glory were tens of thousands of lives. This has not changed in 3,000 years. 2. Diplomacy is as important as war. Kadesh shows that sometimes a treaty is more powerful than 1,000 arrows. 3. Historical memory must be preserved. Despite the embellishments, Egypt's recording of its wars shows us that humanity has always craved to be remembered, so as not to repeat mistakes, or at least so that future generations have something to reflect on. If you were thrown onto an Egyptian battlefield, you would be unlikely to survive. But looking back, we can still learn an important lesson. Humans, throughout all ages, have always found ways to survive and overcome adversity. The anonymous Egyptian conscript, though nameless, struggled on, stood in formation. and raised his shield to protect his comrades. That is the power of the collective, something all of humanity still needs today. Looking back, we see that war does not only leave ashes, but also sows the seeds for concepts of organization, diplomacy, and collective memory. But the biggest question remains: if war is something humanity cannot avoid, can we learn from the past to survive in the future?